you a really super quick intro to Companies House, purely because that kind of gives you the context for the examples that I'm going to talk about today. Then I'm going to talk about what Agile is. Then we'll give a little bit of more of an in-depth look at Scrum, which is a framework within Agile, and explain what that is and what can be used. Then I'm going to look at some elements of it that I think could be applied to any team. And then throughout this whole talk, I'll talk about my own experiences. Some of them good, some of them, frankly bad, possibly ugly. And, hopefully that will be helpful to people. I just want to reiterate, there's obviously a lot out there in the Agile space. This is just my opinion based off of my experience of working in this area. Some of you who, more experienced might disagree, and that'd be interesting. But yeah, so hopefully this is useful for people. I'm going to kind of stop at the end of each slide roughly to kind of take any questions people might have. Please do interact if something pops into your mind and you think, oh, that's interesting, I'd like to know more about that. And there's also a little interactive element halfway through, just to kind of wake you all up after you've been listening to me for a bit. So you'll need a pen and paper or like a word processor or a notepad or something, and you can put your answers in the chat function. So it's hopefully like pretty stress-free. So that's what we're going to do. Hopefully that's what you all were expecting and signed up for. So I'm on the wrong screen. That was a good start. Okay, so what is Companies House? Companies House is part of the Department of Business and Trade. Our main purpose is to hold and maintain the public register of companies based in the UK. So you may be familiar with our search company records site, where you can go on and find out free of charge any company in the UK, who runs it, who owns it, the financial state of that company, whether they filed their accounts, all of those kind of things. And companies use our services to update that information and make sure the economy is transparent and people know what's going on with the money flowing through the UK. And I work in digital at Companies House. So we build and maintain those services. We also build and maintain the services for our colleagues in operations who process that data and deal directly with businesses and the public. So that's what Companies House does. Just going to pause there if there's any questions on Companies House. Cool. We'll get into the juicy bits then. So what is Agile? So Agile came about sort of in the early start of in 2001. It's outlined in the Agile Manifesto, which you can look up online, and it sets out these 4 values, which you can see on the screen, and also some principles as well, which we'll talk about in a minute. Basically, it came from people who were working mainly in software who thought there's a better way of doing this, and they got together and they spent the weekend in a ski resort in Utah and came up with these values and principles that have kind of informed how Agile looks now going forward. So you can see outlined there the 4 values on the slide. So I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail about what I think those values kind of mean and why they can be powerful for people. So yeah, individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And like, to me, this is about creating collaborative spaces for people. And I'm not talking about physical spaces there, although that is also helpful, but like spaces in how we work for people to work together, rather than having one size fits all processes and lots of documentation and steps. And, I'm definitely not saying get rid of all of your processes. A lot of my job is looking at how our processes can be better, but prioritizing how people work together, giving them that space to come up with creative solutions together is more important than having a really tight step-by-step process that everyone has to follow. And when I'm working with teams, we kind of, people should be safe to kind of challenge things and say, well, actually, we're not getting any value out of that step of this process. Why do we need to do it? And it might be that it's valuable for someone else, in which case, okay, we can have a discussion about that. But sometimes it's just not, and we do things out of habit, and we can kind of make things a bit more lean, a bit more effective. So that's what that one kind of means to me. working software over comprehensive documentation. I kind of like to summarize this one as like doing things is more important than writing about doing things. It's like really hard to know if something will work until you've tried it. The more novel or innovative your idea or thing you're trying to do is, like the more that's true. It's a silly example, but at the moment we are kind of moving to a new piece of software for our timesheeting. And previously we had like an Excel spreadsheet. It's very frustrating for people. We've got this lovely new piece of software, and we sat down to try and like write the guidance so that people could know what they needed to do, understand our policies. We spent a few hours as a sort of team looking at that, and then we sort of published it, gave people the tool, and then we found out all the things that people actually needed to know in that guidance, because we hadn't thought of things like, what if I'm part-time and I work a bank holiday, but then I don't take it on the bank holiday day because that's not, Monday's not a working day for all of those kind of things that we would just never, well, I mean, we could have spent months analysing all those edge cases, but it was much easier to kind of put it out there and then be available for people to give us that feedback and kind of update our documentation based on what users were actually seeing. It's a bit of a silly example there, but like, it cuts out a lot of waste if we can kind of get people using stuff and get people like sort of seeing how that works. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. Again, the way my brain thinks about this is kind of working together is more important than winning. Getting the right outcome for everyone is what's important, rather than sort of one group gaining on another, which is kind of what contract negotiation kind of puts in my mind. This idea has been like really embraced across the public sector, and you might have heard of things like co-designing services, where we kind of work with citizens and with our users to kind of plan how things are going to work for them as well. It's very easy to kind of look at a problem that doesn't affect your actual life and you're going to solve it one way, and then for people who are actually got a stake in that, they're going to maybe tackle those problems differently. At the moment, we're kind of trying to apply co-design to how we build our project teams. So in the past, we'd had a project manager or a senior stakeholder kind of come with a list of, right, I've got this project, I need these people to do it. And then we'd give them those people because, someone asks you to do something, you accommodate that. And then we'd kind of get through the project and it wouldn't be the right shape. So instead now we're sort of trying to work with people to come to us with an outcome that they're looking for, like what are they needing at the end of that. And then as the sort of digital specialist, we can say, yeah, okay, if you want to achieve that, you need a content designer, you need a user researcher, you might need 3 developers, and we can kind of help them form a team by working together, rather than just making them come up with a list and seeing whether or not we're going to say yes or no. We've been seeing that work really well in kind of how effectively we're sort of building our project teams. And the last one, responding to change over following a plan. Like, I love a plan. I'm going to put my hand up here and say there's something very comforting about, sort of looking at everything you need to do and plotting out how you're going to do it. But in reality, we live in a world where those plans have already changed the minute we've kind of pressed save on the document. The pandemic wasn't in anyone's 5-year plan. We've all had to learn over the course of the last few years to be able to respond to those changes. And I think accepting that change is an inevitable thing and focusing our energies on how we can make our organisational planning, our team planning responsive and not kind of it not be too much of a big drama when we have to make changes is kind of going to be the way that we can be more successful, rather than trying to put more effort into like, how can we plan better? How can we, we need to work with the information we've got at the time. So that's kind of my quick brief overview of what Agile is and what those values kind of mean. As I said before, there's also 12 principles that go with them. And if this has interested you, I'd encourage you to have a look at the Agile Manifesto. If you Google it, it'll be the first hit, where they kind of go into what the principles are as well that back this up. But my sort of unofficial summary of that is work with your users, the people who are going to use whatever work you're doing, fail fast. If it's going to be wrong, better to find out quickly rather than like months and months into an endeavour. Deliver things early and get feedback. and focus on continuously improving. And that's kind of what the principles are in more detail. So that's a very brief introduction to the idea of Agile. Any thoughts or questions there?
Hi there. Sorry, can you just repeat that that fourth one that you were saying there? You were talking about working with users and failing fast and delivering early, but I didn't quite catch the fourth thing that you said.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, focus on continuous improvement. So that's
yeah.
I'm going to talk about that in a bit more detail later on in the talk, but looking for ways to be working on getting better at working, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Maria. Cool. Okay. So then within Agile, there's like several frameworks and methodologies that can kind of help us to implement Agile in our working environments. There's loads, there's Kanban, there's extreme programming, there's Scrumman, there's lots, but I'm going to focus on Scrum for the sake of this, because it's what we use at Companies House. We find it really useful. So yeah, a little intro to Scrum then. It's based on the concept of empiricism, which is, a fancy way of saying learning from experience, which just seems really natural to me as someone who likes to learn by doing things and getting things wrong and doing better next time. And it does that by having these, what it calls the 3 pillars, which are transparency, inspection, and adaptation. And the whole process really is about giving teams opportunities to be transparent, to inspect what they're doing, and then to adapt to do it better in the next cycle. So yeah, Scrum works in cycles called sprints. These are time boxed so that it's all very clear on exactly what is going to happen and what the expectation is. And each cycle should move you closer to what your sort of team mission is. And in Scrum, that's called the product goal. So it's like the long-term goal of what we're trying to achieve with this work. And then each cycle you have what's called a sprint goal, which kind of moves you a little bit closer to your product goal. So it's all very outcome focused, which is helpful. So I'm just going to give you a quick whiz round the diagram to explain what happens in each sprint. So you start with your product backlog. And that's just basically a list of all of the work that you need to do to achieve your goal as a team. And that should be kind of prioritized. And these bits at the top will be well understood. That's the kind of work that you're going to pick up next. And down the bottom can just be like really high level ideas that you think, yeah, that would probably be a good thing for our product, but we'll look at it when we've done some of the things that we're more sure about. So you don't have to have everything in a really like high level of detail. You can keep working on that as you go through the product. So you have your product backlog, and then you start off with sprint planning, and in that session you look at the top of your backlog, you take the first chunk of items, and the team decide what's a realistic plan for their time box. We use 2 weeks at Companies House because we found that to be like a good balance between long enough to get something meaningful done whilst being short enough for us to be able to adapt to change and to have regular kind of inspection and adaptation. So the team plan out their sprint, and then we're off into the sprint. So you work on all of your work, doing that as you normally would, with the addition that every day you have Scrum, which is a super quick event, which I'm going to talk about again a bit later on, but it's just for you to all touch base with each other and plan the next day. So all the way through, you're sort of continuously looking at what you're doing and ways to improve it. And then at the end of each sprint, you have the rather fancy sounding increment, but it's basically just a chunk of work that is complete in a software context. That might be a new version of a website or an application. It could be a marketing plan, it could be a new piece of policy, like whatever context you're working in. And then you have a sprint review, and you invite all the people who've got a stake in that from across your organization, and you show it to them and kind of have like a constructive conversation with them about what you've built, and they might say, oh yeah, that's really good, we hadn't thought of that, and like now we've seen it, it'd be really good to have this. Or they might be like, oh no, that wasn't what we meant at all. You know, sometimes that does happen, but it's only a short amount of time. So if you have gone a bit wrong, it's not the end of the world, and you can kind of go back into your next sprint and kind of reprioritize some different things to make that work better. That doesn't happen very often, but at least there's a mechanism there for that. So you do that with your stakeholders, and then as a team, you have a session called a retrospective. And again, we'll talk about this in a bit more detail later, where you look at how you worked together in your team and what, you know, what worked, what didn't work, what you'd like to improve, and you take some actions forward into your next sprint to kind of have a look at some of those things. And then it starts all over again with the next highest things in your product backlog. So this is working really well for us in our sort of software teams at Companies House, because it gives us those regular touch points with our stakeholders, regular opportunities to make improvements as a team. You know, you can achieve all of those things without applying the Scrum framework. But what I think is really good about it is it does give you like some rules and some disciplines. So if you're looking at starting some of these things, there's some like really nice guidelines out there. It also gives you a common language. So if you're searching for help online, you know, you can say, how can I improve my retrospective? It kind of gives you a gateway into that kind of terminology. However, doing a full-scale transformation to using Scrum, you know, is massive, even just for one team. So I'm going to spend the rest of the talk talking about some practices that you could pick up in any team, even if you're not at a point where you want to go the full Scrum slog. And in fact, you might never want to do that, but there's still some things that I think could be really valuable. Okay, I'm going to have a little sip of my coffee and see if there's any questions at the end of that slide. Yeah, so hopefully that all kind of makes sense. And we'll move on now to the next slide, where we will if my computer plays ball. There we go. Cool. So this is one of the big myths I think about Scrum. It sort of originated in software, but globally it's being used for all kinds of teams. And in the most recent version of the Scrum Guide in 2020, they really looked to call out the fact that, you know, it is something that can be used by different types of teams. And I mean, I'm going to talk about software a lot because that's my background, but I have seen it work in other contexts, and I use it with my leadership team. We don't do a full Scrum implementation as a leadership team. We just use some bits that are helpful to us to keep us on track, and I'll talk a bit more of that as we go through. I've highlighted 4 things I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail that will kind of helpfully be good for any team, and I'll explain what they are and why I think they could be valuable. Yeah, that's that one. Cool. So the first one of these things is the Scrum values. So they're on the screen. I mean, hopefully we can all agree that they sound like really good things for any team. But what do they mean? So commitment, first of all. So as I mentioned a couple of slides back, Scrum has a goal for every sprint, and the team commit to delivering that goal. And they also commit to each other. So it sort of takes away some of the like competitiveness, some of the like hero culture you can get. Scrum is really about the team. So it's about, we're going to achieve this thing, we're going to achieve it together. And I think there being a requirement of Scrum teams to kind of commit to doing some work really drives really good conversations about that work. Because as a person in a team, if you've got to say, yeah, I understand this and I've got the capacity and capability to deliver it in the next 2 weeks or the next 4 weeks, you're going to ask questions to make sure it's clear. You're going to be making sure that that thing that the stakeholder's asking for makes sense. You're going to be invested in kind of helping them come up with innovative solutions. And you're going to feel empowered because you'll be interested to say yes or no to what work you can do. I think, you know, a little health warning with that though, sometimes it can go a bit wrong because people can feel like they can make a team commit. They say, oh yeah, one of the Scrum values is commitment, so you must deliver this by this date. And And obviously that kind of has the opposite effect. And, you know, it's something to kind of look out for. It's not for managers to make people commit to their work. It's got to come from the team in order to have that value. But when it does, it's really powerful. Okay, now focus. I'm going to try and do a little activity for focus. So yeah, if you've got a pen and paper, or you can type in another screen or something, I'm going to do a little quiz. Okay, and I'm going to give you 4 words, and those 4 words have a connection. Okay, the connection is nothing to do with Scrum or Agile or anything, it's just general knowledge. When you think you know the answer, can I ask you to just pop it in the chat function? Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, and you're all ready. So first round, first word, B. I've got a bit of a cold, so that's B for Bravo, in case anyone didn't quite catch that. All right, second word, O. Third word, T. Fourth word, S. Okay, back to the first word again. First word, L. Second word, A. Third word, A. Fourth word, P. Back to the first word again. First word, U. Second word, S. Third word, K. Fourth word, I. Okay, first word, R. Second word, I. Third word, E. Fourth word, C. Now, first word's finished, so there's no more letters for the first word, so hopefully you've got something that makes sense as a word there. Maybe it's starting to become clear what the connection is. Second word, S. Third word, T. Fourth word, E. Hang on, my computer's being slow. They are bands. Oh, you clever bunch. This is the more difficult one. I'll release you from the pain there, because that wasn't a very easy way to do it. Don't worry if you're completely lost. That was kind of the intention. But yeah, well done. I think I've probably shown my age and my musical taste a bit too much there. So we're going to have a second round now, if you're up for it. We're going to do it slightly differently, okay? But same thing again. 4 words. There's a connection between the words. There isn't a prize, unfortunately, just the glory of winning and feeling satisfied with yourselves. Okay, so here we go again, second round then. This time, first word, C A R D I F F. Second word, P A R I S. Third word, B R E R. They are capital cities, but Cardiff, Paris and Berlin there. Hopefully that was a bit easier. You all seem to have got that one a bit quicker. The last one would have been London. And yeah, for the first round as well, if anyone's still a bit confused and didn't quite catch it, it was Blur, Oasis, Spice Girls and Take That. But yeah, hopefully that shows why it's easier to focus on one thing at a time rather than chopping and changing around, trying to get information on lots of different sources at the same time. And it's the same for teams, and that's why Scrum has a value of focus. If you allow people to concentrate on one task, they'll do it faster, it's less stressful, there's more quality there. So that's kind of why focus is important. So hopefully that kind of illustrated that in a bit of a fun way and woke you all up a bit. And well done. I'm very impressed you managed to get through the bands, because that was an ordeal. So openness is next. And similarly for this one, I'm going to illustrate it with a bit of an anti-example. So back in my early days of my career as a Scrum Master, my team were under a lot of pressure to show something, and we had it working from an input screen all the way through our complicated internal stuff to an output screen, apart from one bit. And, you know, that bit was just proving so hard. But I thought, you know, we'd be able to do it if we could just like be left alone to get on with it. So when we had our demo, we kind of just glossed over the fact that that bit wasn't working, and all the senior stakeholders left feeling chuffed and happy, and yeah, we're doing good. I want to make it important, you know, very clear here that we didn't lie. We just didn't lead them down a route of inquiry that would have led them to realise this. So I was like, great, okay, good, we've got some breathing space now. Unfortunately, it actually took us 2 more months to find a solution to that problem, and those months were horrible. They're probably some of the worst time of my working career, because we hadn't been open. So all the time we'd put all this pressure on ourselves to get this thing done because we hadn't been open about it. Whereas I think if we'd come clean at the beginning, there would have at least been understanding. We could have got some help and support. And since then, I've had a really strict openness policy. And sometimes that's meant I've had to have some quite awkward conversations with people, because sometimes things just aren't feasible. But no awkward bad news conversation has ever been as bad as living through that time when we hadn't been open. And so we'd created this really stressful situation for ourselves. And I think, you know, my sort of reflection on that would be, the people are normally like really understanding and really helpful if they know where they are with you. So yeah, cannot advocate openness enough. Don't do what I did. Respect. You know, this is one that should sort of be quite a fundamental one, but the Scrum Guide actually describes this as starting from the assumption that everyone in the team is a capable, independent person, and the agreement to respect them as such. And I've just found that like a really helpful thing as a leader throughout my career, because it kind of makes you think, yeah, you know, we've employed these brilliant people and they're capable, independent people, so we should kind of give them problems to solve and let them work through it. And our role is supporting that and giving them that space, rather than kind of feeling like we've got to have all the answers and we've got to have all the solutions. And I think working in a team where we start from a basis of respecting each other as independent, capable people, it just works really well, and it's really nice when you see that happening. And then finally, courage. And it's just having the courage to do the right thing rather than the safe thing. And that can be really, really hard, but sort of Scrum challenges us to kind of think in that way. So we should be sticking up for our users, for citizens who are getting the end product of our services, rather than just doing the thing that seems easier at the time. So that's a little intro to the Scrum values. There's ways of kind of implementing those in your teams, like even having a discussion about what those terms mean, how they could be valuable to you, maybe setting up like a bit of a team charter or something. You know, these are all kind of good practices that we could talk more about in a longer length talk. But I just wanted to introduce those because I think they're kind of really powerful, fundamental bits of what we're trying to achieve with Scrum and Agile. Yeah, I'm just going to pause for another sip of my coffee. If anyone's got anything they want to ask or add. Cool, we'll crack on then. So my next tip that I think can work really well in any team is to have a daily Scrum. You might remember this from the diagram a couple of slides back. It's the quick event that teams have every day. You might have heard of it being called a daily stand-up, but in the most recent Scrum Guide, it's changed to be called a Scrum to be more inclusive. But the sentiment like still remains that it's like that quick meeting that, you know, you should be content to stand up for, all other things being equal. It's not where you dive down into problems in great detail. But yeah, so it's short, it's time boxed, it's for the team. It's not for a manager to turn up and get a status update. It's for a team to kind of work together on how they're going to progress towards their goals. So it's really about, you know, what did you do yesterday? What have we achieved? What's going to be the most important thing for us to focus on today? Yeah, and I've seen that work really, really well. I think, you know, if you're going to take one thing away from today, having that touch point of 15 minutes with your team every morning just to reset and kind of align yourselves is really powerful. I'm just going to talk about a couple of examples where I've used it and where it was really good. So we had like an emergency situation a couple of years back where we had to respond to something really quickly. And unfortunately, this coincided with being the week before Christmas, so people were already starting to go out on leave. So we were kind of slightly understaffed. The news was kind of trickling through the organisation. I'm sure if any of you work in big organisations, you know that communication can sometimes, you know, kind of pop up in different random places, and people weren't really sure how to coordinate themselves to respond to this emergency that we needed to be quite quick about. So I set up a 15-minute stand-up for representatives from across our digital area and different people who were kind of the stakeholders in the business. And every day we came together just for 15 minutes to look at what we'd achieved over the last 24 hours, to reprioritize, to kind of shift the work back out into different teams again. And we had a really effective response, and it's probably like it was so rapid and we got so much work done in such a short amount of time. And I do really think, you know, one of the keys to that success was having that 15-minute stop point where we could look at, are there any blockers? Are any teams struggling that could do with some help? Are any teams flying ahead that could help someone else? And it was just that kind of point to pull all of that together. And, you know, people just ran it themselves, and sort of by harnessing their collaborative efforts in just 15 minutes a day, we responded much more quickly than we otherwise would have done. And yeah, the other example I just wanted to highlight was like in the early stages of the pandemic, obviously, like everyone else, we went from being in the office to being 100% at home. And we used it as a leadership team, having a daily scrum at that point, which gave us a really strong transition from working in the office to working from home. It allowed us to make sure we were keeping track of our priorities and there weren't things kind of falling on one person. It had lots of eyes on it. And also it was just a like really good opportunity to make sure that we'd like seen each other in a day and that we were checking in. And I think with remote working, that can kind of be a thing that we need to just pay a bit more attention to. So yeah, daily scrum. I think that was everything I wanted to say about that. Don't know if we've got any questions. I do apologize for my voice as well. I'm just going to take a little drink.
Hiya. Just a thought. Does it have to actually be physically in person, or could you drop like a message into a Teams channel just for an update as a daily scrum?
Yeah, and that's an interesting thought. And I think like I have seen teams kind of do like an asynchronous scrum where they're sort of just typing.
Yeah.
I think from my perspective, like as playing like the Scrum Master delivery manager role, you get quite a lot of information from what people aren't saying and how they're responding to each other's comments and things. And I think having that touch point of 15 minutes does mean you get a bit more value out of that. But yeah, some teams do it asynchronously, and like if that works in your context, that's really good. But yeah, I think, you know, a lot of teams use it as their like start the day break, you know, everyone sort of comes together and then but yeah, I think, you know, using chat functions and updates and things is good. I think that back and forth on planning, that, you know, if you do realise someone needs some help or someone's having a problem, can kind of get quite convoluted.
Yeah.
But, you know, you could probably say, oh, okay, well, should we jump on a call? Because we've obviously need to have a chat about that. So yeah, it's definitely possible to do it that way.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Tony.
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. Great session, by the way. Loving it so far. Really good. Just an observation that I've picked up. I think it's great, the benefits that you've sort of highlighted and are, you know, and can be achieved. But I also think it's equally beneficial, the amount of kind of cost avoidance that can be highlighted and sort of managed as a result of having that quick, immediate insight into what the problems are. And it feels to me as if it's almost like a kind of a huge emergency stop button to say, let's stop, let's correct, let's move, correct things in the, and design them in the right way. So that's, just an observation from what I've seen so far. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is a lot to be said for not going off for too long and not getting any feedback. And I think, particularly with the daily scrums, no one's going off for more than 24 hours with the wrong idea, because let's be honest, that happens. We've all done it, we've all experienced it. I think the idea that you come together the next morning and you might be like, okay, you've wasted a day, which is not ideal, but it's better than going off and doing a whole piece of work and then realizing that you've completely got the wrong end of the stick. So yeah, absolutely. Definitely. Thanks, Tony. Tina.
Hi. What's a maximum size team that you find works?
I think for like a team, we normally would say around 7, but we can kind of go up to 10. Most of our sort of fixed scrum teams are 10 people. That kind of works well enough to have enough people to do something meaningful, but like not so many people that your communications become very convoluted. But I'm actually going to talk about an example on the next slide where we had a massive team, and you can sort of still use some of these tactics to get value. But I think with the scrums, obviously if you've got 50 people turning up to a daily scrum, you're not going to do that in 15 minutes. It doesn't really work. So the way that we did it in the example I was talking about there was, even though we probably had like hundreds of people working on the piece of work, we'd have the sort of scrum at a higher level with like a representative from each of those teams, and then they go back and scrum in their own teams and can kind of feed that back and forward. So there's concepts in Agile that kind of like scaling frameworks where you've got multiple scrum teams trying to achieve the same thing. And it's probably beyond this, but yeah, you're absolutely right. With big groups, it's hard, and I wouldn't recommend it. If you've got a massive team, it's thinking about, are some of us doing something that would give us some value? Can we have little subgroups of this? It might not always be the same people in the same scrums, but it's a good question and a good point.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and thanks, Maria. Yeah, like we do them mainly via Teams at the moment, but you do need to be disciplined to keep it to time. I think that's one of the big health warnings around daily scrum, is it can very easily become sort of a half an hour, 3/4 of an hour affair. So if you're sort of the facilitator of that meeting, you need to be on the time box, because people will lose kind of faith in the process if it's suddenly becoming like an hour of their lives every day. It's not as valuable. So yeah, thanks for that. Great. So next technique that I think is quite powerful is making your work visible. And I know, this kind of can come from like Kanban and Lean and things as well. So even if you don't have experience of Agile, this kind of idea of visualizing your workflow kind of comes from those areas. But we do use it a lot in Scrum. Most teams doing Scrum would have a Scrum board. So yeah, I think there's 3 sort of main advantages to making your work visible. Like, number 1 is like providing you're all committed as a team to keeping it up to date, which is something that you do all have to agree to, because otherwise you get the wrong information. But anyone can have a quick look at the board and see where everything else is. So if you're waiting for a task, you can kind of see its progress without having to go and pester someone else. You can get the information without having to interrupt each other. And it sort of protects you from your single points of failure, where if someone's off sick, you can have a quick look and you can see where their work was, what's going on. Someone else can pick it up if need be. The second one is kind of around flow and identifying blockers. This is a really simple kind of workflow to do, doing, done. But you might want to sit down as a team and map out what all the stages of a piece of work are. You know, do you have a stage where you validate with a stakeholder that it's the right kind of thing, and then there might be several steps to doing where different members of the team do things. Then there might be like get it signed off by an exec and then publish it, or whatever the things might be. And by sort of visualizing all of that, you can quite quickly see, oh, hang on a minute, this column's got loads of tickets in it. Oh no, okay, that's all being signed off by the same person. Is there a different way around that? How could we make their life easier? It kind of unlocks a lot of those questions, or like, you know, is our process working for us? And it kind of gives you some really powerful data on that. And the last thing is, I think it makes it easier for you in, say, for example, your daily stand-up to kind of have a visual focal point. So instead of just listening to 10 people give an update on what they've been doing, you can say, okay, right, what's the update on Run Workshop on goals? How are we doing that? And then different people who might be working on that can kind of all feed in, and it's really clear and focused where that conversation's going. We use a board like this in our leadership team. It's really great for like keeping track of information. It helps keep our meetings focused because, you know, we love working together. We love a tangent. We love a random chat. So having a focus of like, okay, this is what we're discussing now. Focused conversation about that really helps us. And like for me as the leader in that team, I can put tickets on there about stuff that can keep till our next team meeting without disturbing everyone to say, oh yeah, by the way, we need to remind people to do X, Y, and Z. I can just pop it in there and it's all ready for the next go. So that works really well. And another example of using this was last year we were asked to deliver the Register of Overseas Entities. You might have seen about this in the news, but it's basically as well as the company register, we now hold a register of overseas companies who own land in the UK, and they're required to sort of register with us. So it's this big project that we'd been planning for the future but came down the line a bit sooner, so we had to respond to change, and we used a board like this across everyone who was working on it in the organisation. So that was our digital teams, people from finance, people from comms, people from policy, and we used it to kind of keep track of our blockers, our questions, all those things. We had like one source of here's where we are with all of those things that we need to progress in this really quick period of time. And it meant then we had a daily scrum as that group where we could go through those things and say, okay, where are we on this? Okay, this thing that we thought we had a little while to do is now blocking us. And it was like a really useful tool for us to kind of keep track of what was going on when there was like quite a lot of complexity and quite a lot of different moving parts. So that can work really nicely like that. And that is making the work visible. So my last top tip is to try and work in increments and or have regular reviews. You know, working in increments isn't going to work for every type of work and every team, but you can kind of adapt things to like work based on what your work is like, because you might have like a regular flow of similar type of work, in which case you might not have like a product at the end of a time box, but it could still be valuable to kind of stop periodically, show it to your stakeholders, get some feedback. Or you might say, well, we're going to do that when we're doing something a bit different and we'll just do it on an ad hoc kind of basis. You know, different things will work for different teams and different types of work, sorry. And also, so yeah, showing your stakeholders early kind of gives you really good feedback. As I mentioned earlier, we're trying to do this co-designing teams thing. And as part of implementing that, I've been talking to our stakeholders in the project and in transformation and showing them like different diagrams of the process, and they'll say, oh no, that doesn't work because we need to have the finances before then. And then I'll go, oh, okay, I need to go away and have another think about that. So, you know, whereas if I'd sort of just gone off and like built the whole process, I'd have a lovely process that worked beautifully for our internal teams and didn't work for anyone else in the organisation. So kind of making sure that you're talking to the people who are going to be affected by your changes is really powerful. And then, yeah, so that's your sprint review in the Scrum framework, but with stakeholders basically. And then you have what we call in Scrum a retrospective, where at regular intervals your team kind of pause, have a look at what you've done over the last time box period of time, and have a look at what you want to work on for the next one. So that could be something really simple, like a session where you look at what's going well, what's not going well, ask people for ideas for improvements. You could do things like looking at everything you do as a team and putting them into buckets of stop, start and continue. Like there's some really great sort of templates out there online. If you search for like agile retrospectives, there's some really good resources out there. And then, you know, if your team are kind of regularly doing those things, you can kind of mix it up and be a bit more creative. Like I played Pass the Parcel with my team one time, and under every layer there was like a question about like, what made you proud in the last time box? What one thing would you want to improve? You know, or I've given out pieces of paper and asked them all to like draw the last sprint. And people kind of think about things in a different way then. It's kind of about unlocking those things. I mean, that can be a bit out there for people, I will be honest about that. So, you know, maybe start with something a bit more like stop, start, continue. But I think you can have quite a lot of fun and creativity and innovation in those regular stop points and come up with some actions that you can kind of take forward to make your working lives a bit easier and more effective going forward. So yeah, that is basically a summary of regular reviews, and that is the end. So I don't know if anyone's got any general questions or thoughts, but yeah, that's everything that I've got for you today.
Thanks, Ruth. Really, really good stuff. Thanks. Yeah, question from me is basically looking at practical next steps for anyone on the call on this session, looking to you know, start to introduce or to suggest the idea of introducing Agile within their organization. What would you suggest as, you know, some of the first steps that they might want to consider, please?
I mean, I think it's, you know, I think my approach to it now would probably be to go for like some little quick wins that you can start proving things are working. So things like doing a daily stand-up is quite a small investment that is relatively easy to set up, that you as your team can kind of show we're getting value from having these regular touch points. So I'd go for some things like that. I'd also have a look at like scrum.org has got some really good resources, some really good ideas and practical kind of guides. That's where the diagram with the circle kind of comes from. But yeah, I'd kind of think about like, as a team, like what are the things that frustrate you the most, you know, and having a retrospective and a session to sort of look down at that can be really good as well. But I would really go for maybe start with a scrum, add in a retrospective and sort of looking at your continuous improvement. I think if you want to go full scale scrum framework, obviously I would say, you know, probably good to get some advice from people that are already doing it, like reach out to those kind of, because it is hard and it's not an easy thing to kind of get traditional organizations moving to that. So I'd also say be kind to yourself as well, because, you know, anything you're wanting to do that's a bit more innovative is hard, but there's lots of people out there doing this stuff really successfully. And yeah, if anyone is thinking about, you know, moving their team to Scrum or whatever, like reach out to me on LinkedIn, or, you know, I'm very happy to have a chat with anyone. Yeah, great. Formal qualifications. I mean, I think, you know, I've got a couple of formal qualifications, and, you know, I think what's been really useful about them is the opportunity to network with other people who are doing Agile and Scrum. I think, you know, we tend to look for those qualifications when we're looking for Scrum Masters, but I think it depends what your role in the team is. If you're just going to be working in an Agile team, there's loads of really great free resources on things like scrum.org, Scrum Alliance, that can kind of lead you in the right path without doing one. you know, I think there is some value to the qualifications, but you can definitely do Scrum and Agile without them. So I wouldn't see that as kind of a blocker. Thank you for all the lovely comments, by the way. It's been nice to read those through. Yeah, I think if you want to, like, I would say Jeff Watson's book, Scrum Mastery, is a really good introduction to a lot of the mindset and what you're sort of thinking about. That's kind of where I started with my Scrum Master journey, but there's lots of interesting things out there online. Do you ever get Scrum burnout? Interesting. I'm not sure I quite understand what that question means. I think the idea behind Scrum would be that you're working at a sustainable cadence. So instead of having a big deadline months and months down the line, you're working at a pace that you can sustain going on and on and on and on. And I think, you know, so you shouldn't see Scrum burnout, but I think, like with everything, it can be easy to fall into a pattern where you're going through the same routine and things get a bit stale. So I think that's where, as a team, you might want to look at like trying something a bit different, or taking a step back and refocusing on the values and why you're doing what you're doing. But yeah, it should be the opposite, because you're trying to work at a pace that's sustainable for the team and is directed by the team, rather than having a big deadline that you're all pushing really, really, really hard to, and then everyone's exhausted for a few months, and then you push really, really hard to the next one. It should kind of prevent that if it's implemented well.
I just wanted to say to steal Andrew's thunder and thanking you on this, Ruth, for running the session for us. It's been really, really excellent, really insightful, really valuable.